Imagine being a woman here in Belgium just over 76 years ago. You, as a woman, wouldn't have been able to enjoy the same basic human rights that we find so normal today. Our grandmothers were born in a world where women didn't have the right to vote on equal terms with men, where women couldn't own property, and where women didn't have access to the same educational and career opportunities as men. It took courageous women like them to gather, to take to the streets, to speak out against this injustice, and to claim equal rights to men. And even earlier in history, we regarded other human beings as property. Enslaved people were dehumanized to the point where they were seen as property of their slave owners, and they didn't enjoy any rights at all. Actually, courts in the US in the late 1800s said that African Americans were not even to be regarded as persons for the law. These were views that were embedded in our legal systems, and it took massive uprisings to get changed. So, norms and values are always shifting over time, as is our society. But the law is always lagging behind, and it takes groups of people to stand up, to call out injustice, to get the legal system changed. I believe society is now demanding the next legal revolution. Next slide, please. Because nature is still regarded as property, property of humans. Parts of nature, like rivers, forests, mountains, are seen as objects, commodities that humans can own, exploit, and use for our own gain. But you know who aren't regarded as objects for humans to use in the law? Companies, municipalities, and even ships are seen as legal persons. Legal personhood is basically a legal status that we assign to entities so that they can participate in our human society. We, with legal persons, assign advocates that can argue for their interest, that can enter into contracts, that can sue on their behalf, they can own property, and generally they have their interests represented in our human society. Let me give you a striking example of why I believe this imbalance between nature's status as an object for humans to use and the status of companies as legal persons is worrisome. When I researched the River Meuse that flows through Belgium and the Netherlands alike, I researched decisions and processes where companies applied for permits to discharge chemicals or other harmful substances into the river. This is allowed by our law. In those processes, I found that there were advocates for the companies applying for these permits. These companies were not just speaking out for the economic interest that they had, but also they were the ones reporting on the ecological effects of those chemicals in the river. At the table, there were other people. There were advocates advocating for human interest and society, but there was no one sitting at the table advocating for the most important stakeholder in this whole process, the river. There was no one sitting at the table speaking out just for the insects, the fish, the trees, the birds, all the life that is dependent on the river. And this is why it is so important that nature gets a voice in these proceedings. This is the most important stakeholder of all. We are dependent on the health of nature as well. And this is exactly what the concept of rights of nature is about. It's not just about shifting how we see nature, from it being an object to it being a subject with its own rights, but it's also about gaining a similar legal status that enables it to have a voice and to speak out for its interests. So what if we could go to court on behalf of trees? In 1972, a law professor called Christopher Stone in the US wrote a groundbreaking article called "Should Trees Have Standing?" Should we be able to go to court and to argue on behalf of trees and trees only, not just human interests? In his article, Christopher Stone said that by getting this legal standing for nature and assigning rights to nature, we would be able to view things from nature's perspective. Because we know that humans have rights, rights to clean water, rights to food, right to life in general. But why doesn't nature have a right to exist, to thrive, to evolve? And by assigning rights, Christopher Stone said, you would be able to make sure that we assign the intrinsic value of nature to nature entities. Because if you think about it, if we only assign rights to humans, what does that say about our value system in regard to nature? Nature has intrinsic value for its own sake, and this is why we could use the concept of rights holdership. It's one thing to say that nature should have rights, but of course you need to make sure that there's a system in place that can ensure that these rights are protected and that can be enforced. For this, Christopher Stone said, we can use the concept of guardianship. Little children, for example, have the same rights as we do, but they can't represent themselves fully in court, for example. But we would never say that we don't take children's interests into account. So what do? We assign guardians with legal capabilities to speak out and to defend the interests of the child. So, said Christopher Stone, why couldn't we apply this to rivers, forests, mountains, and animals as well? Companies have no voice. And by having those guardians, we could make sure that we enforce environmental protection in a better way, because we have a direct voice, a human face for nature. When Christopher Stone presented this idea in 1972, he realized that he would be met with skepticism. Because each and every single time a new entity gets rights, it is seen as odd, laughable, or frightable. Think of the women's rights movement or the abolition of slavery. Christopher Stone knew this was going to happen, but he still found it very important to say that nature should have rights. And he was met by skepticism. People thought it was a bizarre idea, romantic idea that would never gain ground. But in 2019, the United Nations Harmony with Nature program that I'm a part of declared the underlying philosophy behind the rights of nature to be the fastest growing legal movement of the 21st century. From rights of Mother Earth in Ecuador, rights of sacred rivers in Bangladesh, rights of the jungle in the Amazon in Colombia, there are countless examples around the world of guardians, people standing up for the rights of nature. And you might wonder why we have environmental law, right? Well, let me tell you that in 2019, the United Nations had to admit that even though we have 38 times as many environmental laws than we had in 1972, it is not enough to combat biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and to face the climate crisis. So we need new systems, new ideas in the law to protect nature better. I could talk for hours about all the examples of the rights of nature, which is why I wrote a book about the topic. But for now, I will take you to two examples that I find very inspiring, and I hope they inspire you too. First, I want to take you to Ecuador. And this is a story about a cloud forest. Cloud forests are forests that lie at a very high altitude. They are high up against the mountainsides. And because they are so high up, they actually have very special biodiversity, animals and plants that are found nowhere else on Earth. And in 2022, scientists actually estimated only 1% of forests worldwide to be cloud forests. So the Los Cedros cloud forest in Ecuador is special. But still, in 2017, a large mining company obtained a permit to extract mining in this forest, and it would destroy 68% of the forest. So let me tell you again, this was a protected forest that could be cut down to 68% just for mining minerals. And this happens every day in nature protection. Local communities, together with NGOs, took legal action, but not just for their human rights, but also for the rights of the forest itself. And this legal action was made possible by the Constitution of Ecuador. The Constitution being the highest law that we have in a country that embeds the norms, the values that we have in society. The Constitution of Ecuador says that Pachamama, Mother Earth, or nature, has a right to exist, a right to be protected, a right to regenerate its vital cycles and life structures. It also says that all persons, communities and people can call upon the public authorities to enforce these rights of nature. So local communities took the provision in the Constitution to advocate for the rights of this forest. This case went up to the highest court in Ecuador, which indeed said, I will stop mining in this forest. This violates not just human rights, but the rights of the forest itself. And with this, actually, this became a legal victory, not just for this particular ecosystem, but it became a beacon of hope for rights of nature worldwide, to show that if we advocate from the interest of the forest itself, we could stop destructive activities like these. Next slide, please. The following example is Spain, because I wanted to show you that it's not just faraway countries like Ecuador or Colombia that advocate for the rights of nature. It's happening closer to home as well. And this is a story about Mar Menor. Mar Menor is a saltwater lagoon in the southeastern part of Spain. And this is a very special lagoon because it has salt water and high ecological value. There are seahorses, lots of fish and other marine life. It's got crystal clear waters that the tourists love to swim in. But in 2016, this was said to be a green soup because it was highly polluted. In 2019, a huge disaster happened. For days, temperatures lingered around 40 degrees Celsius. A massive heat wave struck Spain. And because it was so hot, oxygen levels dropped in the water that caused all this marine life to suffocate. In the end, after those couple of days, thousands of sea animals washed upon the shores of Mar Menor, dead, suffocated. And this caused a massive uprising, people saying, how can this happen if we have all these environmental laws that aim to protect this lagoon? So in Spain, you can do something called a citizens' initiative, and you can draft a law. So scientists, lawyers, and students grouped together and created a law that said that this lagoon would have a right to be healthy, a right to be protected against pollution. But in 2020, when they were drafting this law, they needed to get a lot of signatures in order to present it to the Spanish parliament. But because of the COVID-19 restrictions, they weren't able to get as many signatures as they needed. But then, another disaster happened. Another heat wave struck Spain, and this time, again, thousands of sea animals washed upon the shores. People described standing at the edge of the lagoon, looking out over the water and seeing fish jump out of the water, gasping for air, suffocating. And it was so horrible, you couldn't walk on the beach without stepping on shrimp, seahorses, dead fish. And this time, the situation was so bad that it actually forced people to sign this citizens' initiative and to say we need a change in the law. So even the minister-president of Spain signed this citizens' initiative. And in the end of 2022, this lagoon became the first entity in Europe to have legal rights. Will this happen in Europe as well? Do we need to wait for environmental disasters to happen before we act? Well, not if it's up to me. I'm the founder of the Dutch NGO Stichting Rechten van de Natuur, and together we advocate for the rights of nature. From initiatives from the Waddenzee UNESCO World Heritage Site in the northern part of the country, down to the River Meuse that flows through Belgium as well, citizens are standing up for the rights of nature and demanding change. And just before my book was published last year, I spoke to politicians and I told them we need laws that recognize the rights of nature, because it can't just be up to well-willing politicians or lawyers to stand up for nature. We need to make sure it is set in law so that in 100 years' time, people can still stand up for nature. But you don't have to be a politician or a lawyer to be advocating for nature as well. I have 2 tips to give you. First of all, speak out. Rights of nature is about a paradigm shift. So next time a decision is being taken about nature in your community, local council, in your company, or even in your family, ask, how would this look like from nature's perspective? Would the River Meuse agree with thousands of microplastics being dumped in its water? Everyone has a unique talent that you can use to advocate for the rights of nature. If you are an artist, give nature a face. If you are a lawyer, advocate for the rights of nature. If you are a communicator, help share nature's story. Everyone can contribute and help, and it is needed. Think back for a second of the women's rights movement and the abolition of slavery. It took thousands of people to speak out against injustice to have things changed. So let me end with a quote from Margaret Mead, which says, "Never doubt that a small group of committed and thoughtful citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, Jessica Den Houten, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Jessica. Yes, very good. I'm looking at the time, so I'm just going to ask you one question. You said there are things you can do. Is it true that if you upload something on Spotify and you put nature as an author, money goes to nature?
This is true. So this is a great example of how nature is becoming a stakeholder and society is demanding this. So actually on Spotify, if you go to the list called Nature, Nature is regarded as an artist and will get royalties of all the songs you listen to.
And who gets the royalties? Is it one forest? Is it a company that represents nature? Who gets it?
This is an initiative by the Museum of the United Nations, and they donate all the royalties that are being earned with these songs to nature conservation worldwide.
So if you don't want to advocate or start a lawsuit, just download on Spotify the nature list, because, I mean, some people just want to do one thing, right? Just download on Spotify Nature List, and then you donate to nature as well. Please give her a warm applause. Jessica de Nouter, thank you. Thank you, Jessica.